Hi, I'm Bobby, and I'm going to teach you about Macro Unit 2.4 and 2.5. So we'll begin with the classical versus Keynesian theory. And the classical theory basically states that a change in aggregate demand will not change output even in the short run because price wages are flexible. And moving on to number 2 here, aggregate supply is vertical, as you can see right there. And then this is the classical range. So aggregate demand can't increase without causing inflation. And now, moving on to the Keynesian theory, which you can see right here. A decrease in aggregate demand will lead to a persistent recession because price resources, wages, are not flexible. So people's wages are staying the same, but the economy is in a recession. Number 2, an increase in aggregate demand during a recession will not cause inflation. So, basically, recessions caused by a fall in aggregate demand are temporary because price levels will fall and the economy will fix itself. So no government action is needed. So now looking at going back to the Keynesian theory, when there's high unemployment, an increase in aggregate demand will not lead to higher prices. And another thing that goes along with classical versus Keynesian is sticky wages. And sticky wages prevents wages to fall, so government needs to increase spending to close the wage gap. Moving on to 2.5, the Phillips curve. The Phillips curve is defined by showing a trade-off between inflation and unemployment. So right here you can see the short-run Phillips curve and then the long-run Phillips curve. And they're both showing an inverse relationship between unemployment and inflation. So when the economy is overheating, there's a decrease in unemployment and an increase in inflation. And when the economy is in a recession, unemployment is up and inflation is down. The short-run Phillips curve in blue, when AS falls, it will create stagflation, which is an increase in unemployment and an increase in inflation. So what happens in the long run would be wages and resource prices increase, aggregate supply will fall, and the short-run Phillips curve will shift to the right. In the long run, there is no trade-off between inflation and unemployment. Here's an example of the classical theory of economics. Recessions caused by a fall in aggregate demand are temporary. The price level will fall and the economy will fix itself. Here's an example. We have aggregate supply and then aggregate demand. During a recession, aggregate demand will fall. So we have aggregate demand 1, the equilibrium point, and then our new point. So basically, since aggregate demand fell, the price level will decrease and the economy will go back into equilibrium. The Keynesian theory basically states that you have your aggregate supply as a straight line and your aggregate demand. And when aggregate demand falls, prices don't fall. So all we get is a decrease in output from Q to Q1, and then you have your price level staying the same. Here we have an example of a Phillips curve that'll represent stagflation in the economy. So we have our short-run Phillips curve, and then that is illustrating that there is low unemployment and high inflation, or the opposite, low inflation and high unemployment. So when there's an increase in unemployment and inflation, stagflation, in the economy, the short-run Phillips curve is going to shift to the right, and that'll illustrate that both inflation and unemployment are at a high.
Hello, I'm Lauren Hull, and I'm going to be teaching you about fiscal policy and problems with fiscal policy, Macro 2.6 and 2.7. All right, so there are 2 types of fiscal policy, discretionary and non-discretionary. Discretionary is when Congress creates new bills that are designed to change aggregate demand through government spending or taxation. Non-discretionary is when permanent spending or taxation laws enacted to work counter-cyclically to stabilize the economy. There's also things called the brake and the gas. The brake is contractionary fiscal policy, which are laws that reduce inflation and decreasing gross domestic product, which closes an inflationary gap. And then the gas is an expansionary fiscal policy, which is laws that reduce unemployment and increase gross domestic product, which also closes a recessionary gap. Now onto the multiplier effect, which is an initial change in spending that will set off a spending chain that is magnified in the economy. Also, for some effects of government spending, which include marginal propensity to consume and marginal propensity to save. Marginal propensity to consume is how much people consume rather than save when there is a change in income. Marginal propensity to save is how much people save rather than consume. Now these are the two equations you would use to find both. The spending multiplier and the tax multiplier. A spending multiplier represents the multiple by which gross domestic product increases or decreases in response to an increase and decrease in government expenditures and investment. The tax multiplier represents the multiple by which gross domestic product increases in response to a decrease in tax charged by governments. And these are the equations you would use to find them. Point 7, which is problems with fiscal policy. Two major problems are budget deficit and national debt. Budget deficit is when the government expenditures exceeds its revenue, and national debt is the accumulation of all the budget deficits over time. Some additional problems are problems of timing, which includes the recognition lag, the administrative lag, and the operational lag. Recognition lag is when Congress must react to economic indicators before it's too late. Administrative lags is when Congress takes time to pass legislation. Operational lags is when spending/planning takes time to organize and execute. Number 2, which is politically motivated policies, is when politicians may use economically inappropriate policies to get reelected. Also, government spending might cause unintended effects that weaken the impact of the policy. Number 3 is crowding out effect, which is when the government crowds out consumers and/or investors. And number 4 is net export effects, which is international trade that reduces the effectiveness of fiscal policies.
So an example of the multiplier effect is if Bobby spends $100 on Jason's product, then Jason now has more income, so he can buy $100 of Nancy's product. And so then Nancy has more income, so she can buy $100 of Tiffany's product. Resulting in $300 increase in consumer spending. Say you have a recessionary gap. You would use the expansionary fiscal policy to close the recessionary gap. So say there's an increase in government spending. You would then shift the aggregate demand line to the right, then closing the recessionary gap. Say there's an inflationary gap. To close that inflationary gap, you would use contractionary fiscal policy. So say there's an increase in taxes, you would then shift your aggregate supply line to the left, closing the gap.
Yes.
Go.
The economy is like a car on one tank of gas. You could drive 120 miles an hour, which would be extremely low unemployment.
Or you could drive 20 miles per hour, and that would be high unemployment.
Whatever. Or you can sustain a nice 70 miles per hour, and that would represent full employment.